Let's start our Smartcast for June 13th, 2012 with Frank Goodwin, Confined Spaces, Part 3. Frank, go ahead.
Okay, sure, sounds like a soap opera, you know. But Confined Spaces, I did do it in 3 sections because I really believe it's one of the most important aspects of safety that we have, and many, many businesses do not pay enough heed to it. So many plants and factories and people out in construction enter into places that really should be deemed a confined space. And they wind up, you know, it's not like breaking a finger or stubbing a toe. People wind up dead. So we decided to make this in 3 parts to emphasize its importance, and then to emphasize that there are different aspects of confined spaces. And today we're going to emphasize the rescue and retrieval from confined spaces, and of course the requirements of getting a permit and the importance of having a permit. And so some of it will run over what we've already talked about, but you learn by rote, you learn by repeating things. So let's just move ahead. And you know that some employers today, confined spaces is so important, some employers do not even allow their workers to do the confined space work. They contract it out and get other people to do it because they don't want their employees having to go through all the training necessary, and they don't want the responsibility. So, but there's many hazards. You know, in a confined space, any hazard is multiplied by the fact that it's in a confined space. It's magnified, it becomes more serious. And we're going to discuss here some of the things that are required for confined space work. The entry procedures, the permits, the employee training needs, the duties of the confined space worker and the watcher, so to speak, and then the emergency and rescue services that are required. Now, how is entry into a confined space classified? Number 1, any high hazard confined space is a written permit. And you've got to have a system in place to not only write the permit, post the permit, and then keep the permit. So that if there was ever any OSHA inspections, you can show an ongoing system of permits. And then there's alternate entry procedures which are allowed for controlled atmospheric hazards only, and then there's no permit. Sometimes you don't need one. We've pretty much covered that in the last few weeks, and I don't know that we'll get into that too much today. What determines your options if it needs a permit or not? If the atmosphere cannot be controlled or there are real serious hazards, you must use the written permit system. And if you're unsure if it's that bad, so to speak, then you must use a written permit system. And only if you know can determine there are no hazardous atmospheres can you avoid using a permit. And that, believe me, is not very common. The alternate entry is if the only hazard is atmospheric toxic gas, and that can be 100% controlled by ventilation, and you can prove that, then you may use less restrictive procedures, and they have fewer requirements, no written permit. But again, that is a rare instance, and usually you're safer and better off to just go ahead and use the permit system. Now, I'm talking here not only for the worker's sake, but for the employer's sake. If someone is killed in a confined space because of hazardous air or toxic fumes, I'm going to tell you what, the inspectors will be all over you like bees on honey. So you need to make sure that you don't just say, I don't need a permit on this. And then whenever you're going to enter a confined space, You need to monitor the air. And you have two ways to do that. Number one is you monitor it with a gas monitor before anybody enters. Okay, number one. That has to be done before anyone enters. And then number two, the worker going down in the confined space needs to wear the monitor with an alarm on it to tell him if the air is turning bad. And if there's no monitor alarm, then he needs to check it frequently. And then you check all levels. You check all kinds of gases. And depending on your industry, what you're doing, typical general industry will check, number one, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and then usually hydrogen sulfide. Then there are other tests you can run, and the monitor will have them built in. Typically, most companies can get by with a monitor that checks for the 4 gases, and it's always going to be oxygen. They always check the oxygen level. And then your company, you may deal with a lot of ammonia. You may have to check ammonia gas levels, or you may have to check nitrogen gas levels. Depends on, again, what you do in your company. And if you ever have any questions on that, you can send us an email, tell us what you do, and we can probably give you an answer. Now, ventilation, typically it can be fresh air blowers or exhaust fans. And that would be a large flexible duct drop down into your confined space, putting in clean air. If the confined space has an opening, it'll usually blow out any excess out of the opening. And make sure that it's not too small. Make sure it's providing enough cubic feet a minute. And then the exhaust ventilation must be used. There's no exceptions. You must use this ventilation system if you're welding or using any kind of chemicals. My recommendation is, if you're down there, have it ventilated, no matter what you're doing, because you just don't know what's going to happen. And then you need to watch out for pockets of unventilated, contaminated air. They will build up in areas, corners, if you've got obstructions, if you've got machinery down there, you can have those take place. Now, contaminated air might just diffuse, but it could be a methane-type product that would build up in a pocket and cause some form of ignition. And then what's required for a permit? Well, a written permit. You have to have, and we can give you plenty of generic boilerplate permits. Extensive employee training. This isn't something you just hand the guy a permit and say, hey, fill this out before you go in. You must have documented training that the people who enter confined spaces, the people who are the watchers for confined spaces, have had employee training. The class is usually somewhere in an hour and a half, 2-hour range, depending on your own company. And then any employee assigned duties around the confined space. You know, if he's the watcher or if he's there as a helper, they need to have this training also. Anyone involved. So if you are going to have confined space on a certain day, and you've got one person trained, and your watcher who's been trained is not there, you can't just go pick someone out of the plant and say, hey, do this. No, that's done very commonly. And they tell me to just stand up top and watch the guy, make sure he doesn't keel over. Well, I'll tell you what, if something happens and that person wasn't trained and you didn't have documentation, you'll be in court. So and then the permit states who's going into the space. And then it states who's going to watch and spot for the man in the space. It specifies any safety equipment, i.e. a ventilation blower, a respirator, a PAPR system. It also gives an estimate of how long the job will take. Now, here's where you can save yourself some paperwork. If the job is going to spread over 2 or 3 days, and it's you know, he's going to work an hour today, and then there's other things you do. Then there's another hour in the confined space. You can spread that permit over those numbers of days, and then put in each time the man enters, and during the course of the work, and then you put in each time he goes in, and the gas monitor results for each time. You can't just do it the first time and let it run for 4 or 5 days. And then you state on there what hazards are found. If the gas monitor shows a lack of oxygen, if it shows too much carbon dioxide, that is registered when you take your reading with your monitor. And then the written permit also includes any other methods that you've used to control the hazards. What do you consider acceptable entry conditions? This has to be determined by the company. OSHA doesn't lay down that you got to do this. You determine what's acceptable. Now remember, that is nice to say that you determine it, but that also means that if anything goes wrong, you're the guy that determined it. You're the company, and you'll be responsible. And then any necessary equipment that the person going in and the person watching must wear. Remember, if you're going to give the man going in a respirator to wear, or he has a harness on, the watcher has to wear the same harness, because he may wind up going down in. And so you've got to make sure that, he's not running around the plant trying to find a harness to go rescue a guy who's down there. Because sometimes you can't pull them out with a harness. They need assistance. They need someone to help guide that person. He may be unconscious. So, the watcher or spotter has to be equipped with the same equipment and have access to the same monitor. And then, again, it has to have the air monitoring results. Communication procedures. This is very important. A lot of places figure if the guy down in there can hear you holler, that's okay. You got 2 people hollering back and forth. That may not be acceptable. You may have excess noise. You'll be near an airport and jets go over and the person down inside can't hear it. You may have compressors running. So you've got to make sure that the person down inside can hear the person spotting for them, and vice versa. And if they can't, then you better provide them a walkie-talkie or something that'll work. Communication is vital. And then you've got to have the person watching and spotting needs the phone number, immediate phone number of the nearest rescue service. Now, that may be in-house. That may be that you have a rescue crew at the plant. If you're in a city that has rescue services fairly nearby, can get there in minutes, then you need that number. Remember, the spotter, the man watching, isn't just up there drinking coffee. He has a very, very important task. He may wind up saving a life by his quick actions and his quick communication with rescue services. And then again, respirators may be required to enter a space when there's toxic chemicals that are above a PEL. The supplied air respirator is required for toxic chemicals. For instance, if it's a toxic type thing that can kill you, not just asphyxiate you from taking away oxygen, then you must have a supplied air respirator. And that means you're going to be hooked to an airline, or you're going to be wearing a pump, whatever it is. You have to have that if it's what they consider immediately dangerous to life or health, and that's IDLH. And then a respirator that does not supply fresh air is not recommended for use in a confined space. So even though you might wear one that just has cartridges on it, they don't recommend them in a confined space. We always recommend that you have a supplied air respirator. Very, very important. Then employees who use respirators. Now this is something that, again, companies fall short on. If you're going to have an employee use a respirator, it can be either cartridge or air supplied. You've got to get that person's physical condition written down, sent to a doctor, and this is all has to be done confidentially, but you have them fill out a medical questionnaire and you send it to your workers' comp clinic or physician, and he will have to analyze that man's medical questionnaire. He analyzes it, looks at it, and based on what the person puts down, he'll come back and tell you he can wear a respirator or he can't, or it must be supplied air or whatever. The doctor will tell you that. Now, you're not supposed to see the questionnaire. It goes directly to the doctor. So you can have the guy go to a doctor and fill it out, or you can mail them a questionnaire and make sure they mail it or get it to the doctor. But once they do that, if the doctor comes back and says, John Jones has a problem, he's had some breathing problems, issues, he shouldn't wear a respirator, or I want to check him out. So that may mean that you've got to then have a physical on that person. And usually the physical is just a breathing test that they would give. And then also, at that time, you could have the doctor fit test them, because if they've got any issues, respiratory issues, you want to make sure that the respirator fits correctly. So it's not just a little thing of, hey, Joe, here's a face mask, go down into a confined space. Now, that also carries it forth, then, the person who's up top watching or outside being the spotter. He may have to don that same respirator. So guess what? He has to have the same questionnaire filled out. And once they do that, then he is also qualified to wear it. You cannot assign a respirator to anybody in the plant just because you think they need it. Now, if this is extra, it's not part of confined spaces, but it may be a person in the plant thinks they need one. They have allergies. You've got to go through the same procedure with them. Medical questionnaire and a physical if required. And by the way, you keep all these records, and you need to document this all for OSHA at a later, in case they ever want to see it. Now, the general requirements, we mentioned this. You train a person on confined spaces, anything that's going to be done in that confined space. If they've got to wear a respirator, if they've got to wear a harness, if they've got to wear any special PPE, you have to train them before you assign them the duty. And you need to train them if the duties are going to change. And always document the training. And if there's new hazards, all of a sudden you have a new process come in, and then there's a new gas. Training is required. And the training must establish a proficiency. What that means is you can't just have them read a book. You've got to train them. You've got to test them. You've got to visually see that they know what you're talking about. If it's putting on a respirator, they know how to do it. And then you must then document this has been done, and you've met all the confined space recommendations. I mean, this goes on. It's not a simple thing. OSHA is very, very serious about these kinds of things. And so you've got then permit designated jobs. The entrant, the person who actually goes into the confined space, needs to do all this, needs the training. The attendant, I call him the watcher, a spotter, watching the entrant, needs to have all that same training. And then the supervisor, who's going to make sure they're doing it right, he needs to have all this training. And he needs to, all of it needs to be documented. I mean, you can set up a an Excel spreadsheet. You can keep paper files. You can do whatever you want, but you must document each of these training and assigned duty programs for each person that's going to do this. And you may have several entrants. You may have several attendants. You may even have several different supervisors, and they all must have training and document the training at all times. Then the entrant who goes in, he's got to know and understand the hazards that are in the space he's going into. He must know how to use the equipment properly. This is all part of the training. He must be able to communicate with the attendant. If they're going to have walkie-talkies, guess what? You've got to have walkie-talkie training. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious, but you've got to include that in your training program. Or if there's another way, if you've got two cans and a string, that wouldn't work. But you'd have to train them on however. And we don't recommend cell phones as the communication methods because they can be erratic on signal. So it's better to have a walkie-talkie. And then the entrant must know what conditions are in the space. If there's anything that means I better not go in there this time, he's got to know that. He's got to know his limits and know how to contact the attendant and then know how to exit when ordered and if there's any special alarm when any special situation is noted. Now, some of this sounds pretty extreme, but confined spaces can be extreme. His knowledge and duties, he needs to know the behavioral effects. For instance, certain gases make you act a certain way. And if he starts getting those symptoms, he needs to be able to recognize it and knows who and knows and tracks who is in the space at all times with him. And then he needs to know to warn away any unauthorized persons. If he hears someone coming down the ladder that's not supposed to be there, he needs to tell them you're not allowed in this space. Interesting enough, people will try to go into spaces they don't belong. And workers will think they left a tool, or a worker will think they need to go out and help, or I'm going to show the man something. You would not believe what other workers will do. They're not allowed. Only the person written down on the permit and only the person on the permit who is the entrant watcher. And then the supervisor, of course, he can override all of it. He can go in anytime he has to, but he's got to know the hazards. He has to check the permit procedures. He can terminate the permit as needed, and he can verify that rescue services are available. One of the best things to do is to talk with your local rescue services, usually the fire department, and make sure that they do a practice run to your plant. See how long it takes. Make sure they know what kind of gases or toxic chemicals you might be dealing with so they can be prepared for that if called to your plant. Or they can tell you, we're not trained. We don't know how to do this. It may be a local volunteer fire department. And that way, you know that you're going to have to do it in-house, 100%. And then you need to know that the entry supervisor is the one who can say, you don't belong in there, or you can't go in that space, or get out of that space. And then, as I mentioned, confined space rescue is also very dangerous. And this is why the watcher, the spotter, needs to have all the training, because he may wind up going down in there. And you know what? 60% of all confined space fatalities are rescue people. 60% are would-be rescue people. I say would-be because they died doing the job. And then the rescuers often enter a confined space without thinking about the hazard. The person outside, he's got all his gear, but he hasn't got it on, and he sees a man getting injured. The first instinct is to rush in and get him out. And guess what? He rushes in, and he's in the same pickle as the original entrant. So you rescuers have to have the right equipment, the right training, ready to go. And remember, as I said, not all fire departments can do this. And you may have to set up your own crew, your own trained people. And then using outside rescue services, again, you need to bring them in, let them look at it, but to make sure they are able to do it. And then carefully evaluate whether you think they're able. You know, if you give the okay to the local fire department and you approve their system, and then they really weren't able to do the job correctly, guess what? It's your fault. So you need to do the evaluation. You can use their own, I mean, they can tell you they're able to, but you need to give the final okay. And then you're the one that needs to tell the service, the rescue service, the fire department, about the hazards. That's your responsibility. And then you need to have them come in and do some mock rescues. I don't know if you've ever had to bring someone out of a confined space, but it can be horrendous because you can't always go down in. Or the person going down in needs to put on all the gear, and it can be a real problem. And then using your own in-house service, it's serious and it's expensive. A tripod for rescuing someone out of a in-ground pit or in-ground tunnel, the tripod is expensive. And the winch that hauls them out is expensive. You may need special harnesses. That's expensive. And, you know, getting the people to wear the harnesses is not easy. People don't want to do it. Making sure they're always tethered up to it. That's expensive because you are the one that has to make the people do it. You're going to get a lot of pushback. The workers don't want to wear the harness. The workers don't want to be tethered. They're going to tell you that it's never happened before and they don't want to wear it. But you have to make sure they do. And air supplying respirators. You'll be surprised how workers object to wearing them. They don't want to wear them, and you need to make sure they do. Not just the rescuer, but the person down in there. And then training that rescue team. I know from experience, it's not easy. You've got to find a space. You've got to find a place. You've got to have all the equipment and make the people use it. And then your rescue team must know first aid and CPR. Anyone who is a rescue team, in fact, the person who is going to be the watcher or spotter must know and have some CPR training. They don't need to have the extensive paramedic training, but they must know how to use AED. They must know how to use or perform CPR. And if they don't, you're liable to be in difficulty if a man gets stuck down in a confined space and comes out unconscious, and your people didn't know how to bring him back to breathing again. And then a non-entry rescue, it's difficult. The man goes down in, he's tethered with a harness, and you've got to yank him out with a winch. I'll tell you what, if there's anything in the way, that is horrendous. Now, I've had companies say, well, I don't need that winch, I don't need that tripod, we'll just keep them hooked up and keep the tether up top, and, you know, we'll pull them out. That, you know, a 250-pound man takes extreme effort when he's, you know, a dead weight to pull him out of that confined space. So you've got to make sure that you've got a winch. And then the entrance must wear the full body harness. You can't just have what's called wrist straps or a waist. He's got to have a full body harness with a retrieval line attached. And now they're best suited for manholes and tanks, and the harnesses can't be used in every situation. It may be that you've got to train people to go down in. It may be. And then, as I mentioned, it's usually impossible to pull a person out of a confined space and so you've got to use a mechanical device. And I'll give you this up front. A person may be injured pulling them out of that space, especially if you can't go down to help guide that person's body. They may get injured being dragged out. So it's not easy. I mean, it is not easy. And if you can get the right equipment to go down in and guide the person, you're better off. But that's not always possible. You may not be able to. It might be excess heat, or it could be a lot of things that prevent that. But you've got to make sure that you get the person out of the space. And then we're about finished up here. Anytime you read a written permit, anytime you enter a space, you need a permit if the hazards cannot all be documented and eliminated. You need a permit if a hazardous atmosphere is detected, and if you can't ventilate, adequately ventilate the confined space. And I think that ends it. We won't go through the questions because I think we started a late amount of time. So do we have any questions, Craig, on the line?
Yeah, yes, we do have a couple questions, Frank.
Okay.
One of the questions was, it was in a slide there, but it wasn't really, well, the question is, what is PEL?
Oh, permissible exposure limit is the, or permissible exposure level, I should say. OSHA and the various organizations, safety organizations, have established permissible exposure levels of certain chemicals that you can do with a respirator or without a respirator. And those are available usually on the MSDs, which is the material safety data sheets. So if you've got hydrogen sulfide, that's got a very low permissible exposure level.
Got it. Kind of a similar question was, what is IDLH?
Oh, immediate danger to life and health, or health and life. That's a, again, an acronym that anything that has immediate danger to life and health requires a permit. And then you travel that back further, and I'll use hydrogen sulfide again, that's one that poses immediate danger. So if there's hydrogen sulfide in the space, you've got to have a permit, and the permit might require respiratory equipment. So, but the MSDS is a good guideline for anybody going into confined spaces. You analyze what kind of substances could be in there. You look at the MSDSs for them, and that'll give you good guidance as to what you need to enter.
One last question that we have, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel, or the people that are on the call, if you have any other questions. But another one that came through is, what is the best way to check for toxic gases? I think you kind of alluded to that a little bit towards the beginning of the presentation, but maybe you could elaborate a bit.
Sure. There are a number of different gas monitors available, and you can buy them that check only for oxygen, or you can get them to check for multiple gases. And what you do is, before the person goes into the confined space, the monitor comes with a drop tube, and you drop the tube down into the confined space, and you hold it at various levels, and it will give you readings at the bottom, the middle, and at the top to make sure that there aren't gas pockets or whatever, so a person can go in. Now, some gases settle at the bottom, some settle at the top. If you just took a reading at the middle, you might have good oxygen, but you might be going down into a mess. So that would be one type of monitor. Then well, actually, the same monitor, you take the tube off, and then you put it on the person. Usually they pin it to their clothes, and they wear it at all times while they're down there. So if there's any change in the gas levels, it'll give an audible warning so that you know that, oxygen levels are getting low, carbon dioxide levels are getting too high. And that's why a person has to be well aware of what he's working in. Okay? And by the way, they're not cheap. Gas monitors are somewhere in the range of $1,000. and you have to calibrate them on a regular basis with a tank of calibration gas. And that's part of the training. When you buy a gas monitor, you need to train whoever's going to use it in how to use it and how to calibrate it. And if you don't calibrate it, then when you go down in, it could be giving you a false reading. I mean, nothing is simple about confined spaces. Nothing.
Sounds like it. Well, for the people that are on the call here, those are a couple of questions that came through. But if you have any other last-minute questions, please raise your hand. Press on that little button, and I can call on you if you want to ask a question to Frank. Or you can type your question in towards the bottom of that little thing that pops up from the right side of your screen. There's a place for questions. And while you're thinking of that, if you have a question, raise your hand or type it in. I do have one last question that was kind of more of a personal question, and that is, are wrist straps acceptable in confined spaces?
Yeah. Wrist straps used to be used a lot, and that's it's just a simple little thing that goes on your wrist and pulls your hand together so you can pull someone out by their arms. OSHA has not really approved them. They're still available because there are confined space situations where a harness is not acceptable. I mean, it won't work. You may be down inside an area where there's all kinds of things that will catch on a harness. And so the wrist straps pull the man's arms up and you pull them out strictly by the arms. Not recommended, but sometimes the only way to perform a rescue. And the person being rescued may be injured or may stretch their arms or hurt a tendon. Of course, it's better than staying in there and dying. But again, that's not acceptable by OSHA unless you write it into your policy and you've done the experiments and found out that is the only way to get the person out of the confined space.
All right. Well, Frank, we're out of time. Those are all the questions that we did have, and I want to thank you and thank our people that have signed up for participating in this technical but very good Smartcast. And please fill out the evaluations that will be in your inbox, probably by the time that we disconnect here in a moment from now. And we look forward to having you on another Smartcast in the future. Frank, thank you very much for inviting us this morning. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Have a good day.